Welcome. Thank you for joining our Quality Assurance and Auditing Best Practice Series webinar. I'm Becky Melody, your hostess for today's presentation. Larry Isaacson, USDM Practice Leader, will be presenting. The discussion today will cover introductions, webinar logistics, direction for post-webinar collaboration, and our discussion topic, how to GxP Audit an SaaS software hosting vendor for life sciences. The USDM team is proud to have Larry in a quality leadership role. He offers over 20 years in the application of GxP compliant IT technology in life science organizations. Larry has experience in manufacturing, software development, and clinical and laboratory contract service management in that environment. He recently led the implementation and validation of FDA-regulated global ERP laboratory and quality management systems. He has experience in establishing IT and quality strategy project and change management programs. Larry has held the position of Director of IT in pharma, biotech, and medical device companies. In addition, he holds an MS in pharmaceutical research sciences. USDM is focused exclusively on the life science domain. We're the market leader in providing IT, quality, and regulatory compliance professional service solutions. We're headquartered in Ventura, California, and we are a compliance partner for many best-of-breed vendors, including Cilent Technologies, Sparta Systems, OpenText, Oracle, and SAP. USDM is all about performance and compliance. We've delivered more than 1,000 successful projects with over 130 life science clients, and we're the preferred compliance partner for small, mid-tier, and large life science companies. We specialize in assisting clients with reducing the regulatory risk while maximizing their investment in quality systems, ECM, laboratory instruments, and systems, as well as IT infrastructure. The content will be covered in approximately 30 minutes, and then we'll invite you to post questions for our team via the iLink message board. You'll find that on the lower left of your screen, or you can join the discussion on LinkedIn on the USDM group page there. We're happy to have you post any questions or feedback for us there as well. The overall goal of today's webinar is to facilitate discussion. We want to share ideas and provide the platform and then explore solutions together. Thanks for taking the time to join us, and now we'll turn the presentation over to Larry.
Thank you, Becky. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This topic, auditing SaaS vendors, has become very prevalent in our practice in the last year or so. We're working with many clients who have moved in this direction and have lived to regret it in some respects because they haven't been able to do the due diligence that's often required. And we're going to explore here why that happens and what to be aware of and how you can mitigate that. So we'll cover the trend to hosting in life sciences in terms of SaaS and its variants. We've covered in other seminars the variations in hosting and SaaS that are out there, but here we want to talk about more the auditing side of things. We'll talk about the audit issues to be addressed, the things that come up with this kind of model that you need to be able to manage, and the overall requirement for auditing of IT vendors. Some people are not quite aware where this requirement comes from and how important it becomes when you're dealing with SaaS models. And the assessment of audit requirements. How do you assess the level of auditing required is an important topic because that's going to determine level of effort, and it should be associated with risk, of course. And we'll talk about what are obviously the topics to be covered in audits based on a couple of scenarios, and we'll have some summary takeaway recommendations for you. Outsourcing is not new, as most of you know. It's been around for about 20 years, starting with application development outsourcing that was done by Kodak and many others. in the 70s with some disastrous results in some cases where this was done from a financial perspective. Companies later discovered that they'd given away the crown jewels of their IT organization and a lot of institutional knowledge along with it, and then subsequently were finding that they had to buy this stuff back to regain control. And there are some analogies to what's going on here with SaaS and external hosting in the life sciences area. And while it is a more varied type of scenario and it's not nearly as extensive as what was being done then, it has similar risks associated with it, especially with the compliance component. So often, as was then, while earlier the outsourcing was financially based, you see a lot of IT-related motivations to start outsourcing and moving to SaaS. The data center space and costs have been growing despite the higher density of computing capability and blades and virtual machines and spans, storage area networks. Companies are still seeing increasing space requirements in their data center, and so that's a cost that they would like to avoid. You also get with your software as a service and with outsourced data centers, such as Amazon and Google as an example, we're seeing used more and more in life sciences. Easy scalability. This information is available. Your information and your capacity to store it is available on demand in many respects. Your ability to outsource day-to-day management is a major driver from an IT perspective. You obtain, presumably, uptime and response time service level agreements from these vendors. You can also obtain high availability and disaster recovery services and very robust configurations that they have long managed for their own businesses and can then offer to you. And they often have SAS 70 rated data centers, which is the gold standard of various grades of data center capabilities, a variety of areas, networking, facility security, etc. And often these facilities are better than individual firms could do, except the largest ones, on their own. So for smaller firms, this becomes a big draw. You get the pay-as-you-go application licensing and hardware investments, so you avoid that hundreds of thousands of dollars of licensing you may be required to put out and hardware associated with it. You also would get, presumably in the SaaS type of scenario from a software vendor, specialized application support from experts and also a call center in some respects specific to the application involved, as opposed to a general purpose call center such as desktop support. So that's often a great augmentation for your application development support staff internally to have that resource. And people also believe they'll get simplified GxP compliance from this model, in that the vendor is taking on this responsibility on behalf of the sponsor. The compliance is taken on by the vendor, but it's still a primary responsibility of the client who's contracting with the vendor. Now, of course, there are trade-offs for outsourced hosting, and there's no free lunch, and while these are not as easily quantified, they can be quite significant. Most importantly is the loss of control and oversight for some very important facets of compliance and operations. Staffing and qualifications. You may not be aware of the level of qualification that's being brought into that vendor to perform activities on your system. You don't have direct oversight of that any longer. They may give you certain assurances, but you don't have review of that. The same goes for adherence to SOPs. Presuming they have SOPs, you may not be in the loop when it comes to how they're actually adhering to those SOPs, how they're updating those SOPs, the control processes in terms of documents that are typically required for something as important as SOPs, and whether they adhere to your particular standards and what would be involved, either operationally or from a QA perspective. Change control process is very important. You have to be able to understand how this is going to integrate with your change control, both infrastructure and application. They may have a change control process, but whether that is really going to meet your standard needs to be understood. How they're commissioning hardware, software, and updates to software and to firmware needs to be understood. It's not in your control any longer, so these things are not as transparent as they would have been if you were hosting these things yourself. System backup and security. They may have a variety of provisions and very top-notch technology to perform the backups. However, if they miss a backup or a backup fails, you don't necessarily have visibility to it unless you arrange for that. And how they handle those events and whether they're following SOPs and documenting them as some type of deviation. And if larger things are happening, such as data loss or fires in the data center, this is no longer something you may have direct scrutiny over and even be aware of. There are some trade-offs there in terms of oversight, and then of course costs also factor into it. On the surface, these things look very attractive from a cost perspective, but if you haven't had the time to address the customized capacity requirements you may require, that they come along, and how you would deal with those, whether or not you get a single or multi-tenant deployment. In some cases, they may have multi-tenant deployments for databases as well as applications, and you may prefer a single tenant database or dedicated database server for performance and security. You will have to negotiate that, and there may be costs associated with it. And some may not actually provide for that, a provision for that. And then, of course, if you have special testing requirements, unique integrations you need to do to meet auditing or special custom-related product issues, you would have to negotiate with them for being able to how to execute that if you haven't provided for that already. And then, of course, your ongoing software and database upgrade services, depending on the contracts and whether it's a value added or whether you have access or whether the vendor is doing it, that is certainly a cost, and it's not necessarily very visible to you. However the agreements are structured, things could be going on behind the scenes that may not immediately be apparent. And of course, along with this comes challenges for integration with your own internal systems. So since you haven't outsourced, in most cases, everything, you've got the need to bring data back for data warehousing. You may be integrating CRM that you've outsourced with your internal ERP systems and other customer-facing systems. And so how you do that, what your access mechanisms are to your data, who's got rights to the data, if something goes wrong, those need to be worked through. And then this often, when you add it all up, results in a loss of GxP compliance, which is not exactly what anyone is looking for in this arrangement, but that's what we're seeing is often the case, and in fact tends to be more true than not true in our experience. And why is that the case? So you've probably seen this if you've attended our webinars before. We talked about this model in the past, and we repeat this because this is a very important fundamental understanding that's needed to assess the risk associated with major moves like this in IT and quality, and ultimately for the business. So if you look at this area here, you've got your GMP business process on the left, which is using your applications. So this is the business side on the left that is dependent on the applications. And on the right, you have your internal IT applications and infrastructure that are supporting your business. And this is within your internally hosted model. So within that model, you have some luxuries that you may take for granted. You've got your common internal IT organization, and of course this may be highly dispersed. It may go across divisions for global applications. There are boundaries to be negotiated here, but you typically ultimately have a shared quality management system and a shared QA unit or authority that can provide some more holistic oversight here and set of standards that everybody knows what the rules of the road are. You have typically shared IT service level agreements. You have a much more close coupling with what the business requirements are to what the internal IT organization is geared to perform, either with their own internal staff or with the help of their own outsources that they are responsible for, but ultimately have oversight. When you move to an outsourced scenario, whether that be value-added hosting or SaaS, from a higher risk perspective, you have a very different model. You still have your GMP business processes with GxP applications on your left, with your internal IT organization, your client, your own, you are now a client of the vendor, so we call you a client in this model with your own quality management system. And on the right, you have your vendor environment, which is a completely segmented area with your applications and your infrastructure platform, which may or may not be owned by you, but just actually managed by the vendor in this case in many respects. But the vendor now has its own quality management system of some kind. They've got their own IT organization and their own SLAs internally with that IT organization. So what you end up with is their IT SLA gap in between. Obviously, there's a network connecting these that hopefully is quite robust. But you've got your IT SLA gap and your GMP compliance gap. You have to negotiate the differences between your QMS internally and the vendor's QMS because they are basically have become an extension of your operation. While you may have delegated responsibility for these activities and the compliance to the vendor, you're ultimately accountable from a regulatory authority standpoint for what that vendor is doing. Very much the same as a contract manufacturer has as they manufacture for a sponsor of an FDA, NDA, who has outsourced their manufacturing. Ultimately, it's the sponsor of the NDA that is the one who is responsible for the compliance of the vendor or their outsource. So just a comparison, the before and after here. If before is your internally hosted applications and infrastructure by client, you basically now have your hosting managed by a supplier, and you've lost control of management and real-time oversight and training and activities and documentation, just to mention a few. You may be able to have single-tenant models where you wish in your own internal environment, but you may have to be in a multi-tenant environment unless you arrange differently. And what we're very often surprised is that when we come in after the fact, clients have not been aware that the vendor is using multi-tenant in certain areas. And we find some of the SaaS vendors don't go out of their way to specify exactly what their architecture is. But you have to ask that question. This has security, availability, and risk implications, of course, and depending upon how well it's being managed and how transparent things are to how they're working. One of the other things we've been seeing is that some SaaS vendors, the software vendors, are actually outsourced to a third-party data center, and you have to watch out for that as well. Obviously, you have your own quality system governance when you're internally hosting and you move to an external one in this case, and this accountability that you take on for the supplier's quality system is quite a substantial one. You are actually accountable for their quality system in this case, or your quality group is effectively for all intents and purposes. For your internal systems, they're much more accessible for auditing by the FDA. Internal audits, you have control over accessibility. With outsourcing, your negotiated audit processes, typically the vendors like to have limitations on how often you can come in and audit, and they may not be aware of what a regulatory audit, if it comes down to that, may involve, and may not be equipped to handle it. And certainly you never want it to come to that, but if major issues are seen in a primary audit of your site, they may find it necessary to go and look at the outsourcer as well. And of course, internally, you can determine your schedules and policies for change control and patching and updates. And when that happens, in accordance with what your business needs are, now you've got to negotiate that with another party related to how their change control works, how it's going to dovetail with your cycles and your business needs. And what we often see is there's a very different mentality in some of the software vendors related to their use of an agile software development and very frequent updates that they want to do and are all geared to doing versus a more waterfall kind of model, if you will, have a much more controlled release process with testing in a certain structured way, which is what you would do internally. And again, the benchmark is how would you handle this if this was internally hosted? you would expect your external supplier to do the same. So just to make sure, in case anyone is clear on this, there is a mandate to audit IT suppliers effectively based on a few regulations. The QSR is a good example for medical devices, which is sort of the gold standard that FDA holds people to. It prescribes quality audits be conducted, and it's a very broad mandate. On all the areas the quality gets into, audits are supposed to back up their processes and their assertions and their judgments in these matters, internal and external. And then there's a more specific section 82050 that prescribes evaluation, control, and monitoring of all suppliers, providing purchased material or services to a regulated facility, period, with evaluation of suppliers written against specifications using defined procedures with documented results. So it's actually well spelled out. And it's translated in the GAM-5 to specific guidelines for how to audit IT services from an outsourced perspective. What you find, though, is that the latest version, 5, is still a little bit behind the times because SaaS type models were not very prevalent at that time, and they're typically thinking in terms of hosting. And in fact, what you have to really consider is when you're moving to a SaaS solution, you have a much higher risk than if you were buying just packaged software or you were putting your servers out into a data center, someone else's data center. Because from an internal perspective, when you bring in a packaged software or a piece of hardware in your data center, you have the opportunity to do the testing before it ever goes live. You're required to do your qualifications and your validations for software for those types of systems that need to be compliant. And so you can mitigate the risk before when it comes in the door because it's on your premises. You know how it's going to be deployed. You're going to determine it's fit for a purpose and pass the validation. You will be managing within a quality system how it's maintaining its validated state, its controlled state. Once you let go of that in the SaaS environment, you don't have that oversight any longer, and you're trusting assertions of the outsourcer. And so if things are going wrong in the application management and in the personnel side or in the data center side, you won't find out until your business does, most typically, unless you have done your homework and put in place some kind of monitoring that you'll be able to have some transparency and reporting on the part of this vendor. So effectively, again, you've got to look at the vendor as an extension of your operation, and they must be treated in the same manner as you would for anything that you're in-hosting in terms of the standards. And from a quality perspective, that can be a tall order when you're dealing with complex IT systems. So what we recommend is this pre-purchase vendor qualification audit, not after the fact, but pre-purchase, before the contract's signed. And of course, how do you assess how much is sufficient? We see this as an essential step to establishing the viability and baseline gap analysis for the vendor to verify what you've heard is good news about this vendor. You have options for an on-site or a paper questionnaire based on a risk assessment, and we typically recommend both or high-risk applications. You look at how significant is the role of the vendor to the IT and business process. What's the impact? So an ERP system is obviously very high impact. Somebody like Iron Mountain, it's extremely well understood and may already have been audited by your records department, you may not have to go and do an on-site audit for, based on the contracts you have in place and the assurances. So you have to use some discretion in terms of the significance of the risk if this is really unmanaged or poorly managed. How much risk are you taking here in your core processes, just as you would any other application that you're bringing inside. How standardized or customized is the product? Is it category 3, 4, or 5 in the GAMP risk scale? And the more customized it is, obviously the more important an on-site audit becomes, because you really do want to ask these questions and drill into exactly how that software is being managed, especially with customizations. Are there any benchmarks or references that can be used? And we certainly would not recommend you depend on these exclusively. But for certain, obviously, we're not going to be going and auditing Microsoft or things of that nature for standardized packages that we know has been long used. But for something that's configurable to a significant degree for your particular business and is going to be updated extensively along the way, you obviously have to go beyond benchmarks, but at least benchmarks give you a certain level of understanding. And then how experienced is the vendor providing GxP services? Now here we have a lot of hearsay, and we've gone in ourselves and audited organizations that have a roster of life sciences companies already and have been shocked at the level of lack of compliance we found, because often they just don't understand the level of rigor required to meet the standards that these companies are using internally, and many times companies have not done the due diligence. So as I said before, the outsourced SaaS model carries a higher risk than pure hosting, because in some cases with pure hosting you have control, but they both have significant compliance risks, and we recommend the on-site verification of the questionnaire results that are filled out by a vendor for those significant configurable or customized applications, such as ERP or lab systems. If you're going that far, people are starting to actually use SaaS for lab systems, as well as in some cases CRM, where you're using it for, let's say, orders that go into your ERP system that has a compliant component too, along with a variety of other clinical trial management systems, things of that nature. They're all pretty high risk. Adverse events, customer complaints, we've seen all of those. So what are the topics you want to address in an audit? When you talk about the value-added external hosting of your licensed applications that you own, one of the big models, as an example we've seen with SAP, is that there are companies out there that have partnerships, and they are licensed by the vendor, by the software vendor, to host their applications, but the client's paying for the license, and in some cases the client is doing some remote administration. But the claim to fame of these companies is that they know the application inside out. They are not part of the vendor organization, but they're a partner, and so in that case, there's a mixture of risk associated with it. You may actually be able to customize your configurations much more close than you can with a pure SaaS vendor. You want to look at their quality system first and foremost. Their procedures, their training processes, their change control, document control, CAPA. And many companies will say they have these, but they're talking about IT standards, like those that come from ITIL or COBIT. There's a wide variety of good IT standards out there that prescribe these processes. However, they're usually not at GxP standards. Documentation and rigor and oversight. And obviously the infrastructure, how well are they documenting their configurations, the overall architecture, and their own suppliers. Are they auditing their suppliers in the cases where depending on an outside supplier? And again, in this particular case, they're using your license, and hopefully they are the ones hosting. They're not outsourcing the hosting. What kind of methodologies are they using, and what their call center practices are, what their backup and restore, their HA, their DR. You need to actually delve into that in some detail and ask the hard questions. This is an area we often see people have neglected the alternative sites. If they're buying high availability or especially disaster recovery, you've got to really qualify the disaster recovery site to use it. So it's of no good to you if you're using your compliant applications and you have a failover and no one qualified the foundation of that disaster recovery site. And you would be out of compliance if you went ahead and did production work in that disaster recovery mode. Are they managing the configurations of their OSs, their virtual environments, VMware, Citrix, whatever they're using, their SANs, the security, the various security mechanisms that are in place, and how they're patching? You need to understand all of that in some detail. Obviously, you need some IT expertise to be able to delve into it, but you need to make sure that it is characterized and it makes sense, it holds water, it's defendable, because you may be the one defending it if for some reason there's a loss of data or some other unexplained phenomenon, unauthorized access. What kind of testing are they doing? They may be doing very rudimentary testing of their own from a technical perspective that they consider adequate, and it may be adequate, but it may not meet the level of a qualification. What kind of documentation will they give you? And even if you're doing the application validation, the qualification of the underlying hardware, networks, and storage is still important and must be documented. You've got your communications. What are they monitoring? What are you able to monitor? What kind of notifications will you get? What kind are they getting when there's problems? How do they interact with you? What kind of dashboards can they provide you for being able to get some transparency into their operation, both technically and from a business perspective? Of course, the certifications are important. You do SAS 70 and ISO types of certifications are considered, the minimum you are going to accept, but don't accept them as a substitute for GxP compliance. And the vast majority of times, we have seen people believe that the SAS 70, and certainly the vendors believe SAS 70 is the gold standard, or ISO is the gold standard, and nothing else could really require anything more, and that's certainly not the case. Do they have Part 11 awareness? Do they have a quality unit? And we recommend getting a quality agreement for significant services that you're outsourcing, both SaaS and value-added services, so that they have a very clear understanding, and your quality group has a clear understanding of what the expectation is of that vendor and how it's going to interface with your quality system. And then validation of the core internal QMS systems. If you're using, and by QMS, let's say they're performing backups, they're using an incident management system or quality management system that is meant to be SOP controlled, there needs to be a validation of that system, just as you would internally. You validate your quality management systems. Any of the systems that you use for tracking critical incidents or deviations, you would have to validate, and the same would be expected of them at some level. When you're dealing with SaaS, now the bar goes up, because on top of the hosting, you've got the application side of the equation to deal with that you have offloaded to a significant degree to the vendor. Obviously, it starts with their quality system. They may be focused more on infrastructure and not as much on the application, so you need to make sure their quality system extends to the procedures, change control, etc., GxP standards for the application itself, and the utility and middleware software that supports that, databases, middleware, and security we talked about before. What methodology in terms of software development are they using? How do they deal with the releases? How do they document them? What level of testing will you be able to do before that release is put into production? Will you have transparency and approval over that? Testing goes back to the validation and the qualification, in this case validation of the software, how they're handling patches, because that's often the most frequent type of change that's going on, and there needs to be an assessment of patches. And many people, I see this all over the place, people are all over the place in terms of what's the risk of patching. People think it's low, they trust the vendor, they trust the OS, and we've all seen where patches have caused disarray. Various scenarios, and it may be rare, but if you're the victim, it's not easy to back out of. Communications we talked about before, the same with the application support, as well as infrastructure. Who administers what features? If you're administering the database and they're administering the middleware and the application itself, you can have variations in this depending on your core expertise, but the question is make sure who the primary responsible is, and if there's going to be traceability in how that process is going, is managed in documentation. We recommend the quality agreement, again, especially on the application side, and the fact that you have to have a right for future audits after your initial contract and your initial audit. These same topics would be addressed in follow-up audits. So again, we're looking for the ability to do a preliminary audit before you sign the contract, ideally, or have an out if in your contract based on the subsequent audit. So that you're reducing your risk up front. Just for a quick review, this is what we would look for in a quality system at the vendor. Some type of QA authority that's defined, not just at the manager of the network group or the manager of the application group, who I've often seen as designated the QA authority. There needs to be a little bit of independence for it to pass muster. Someone's a really second set of eyes is looking at the results of changes and the test plans and the test results, etc. For this to hold water, managing SOPs and documents. Some type of repository so that you know which documents are current, and some process of getting them approved that you can audit retrospectively. Manage your procedures, that there's actually a release process for procedures and training associated with procedures, formal change control of some kind, obviously integrated with yours. Some level of metrics and incidents capture and CAPA associated with it. Find policies and procedures about how their quality system works. And again, I can't emphasize this too much. They will assert very strongly they already have all this in place, but they do not often understand GxP levels of documentation required. We have a case where we came in and did this audit of a major SaaS vendor for a major ERP company, and as a result of the audit for our client, they had to bring the lawyers in, change the contract, change the architecture, put in their own servers, and extend their own quality system out to the vendor, and made the vendor go through their quality system because there wasn't one for the vendor in order for them to go live. So that's just one example. So this is happening out there. So to sum up, we recommend do your due diligence prior to the finalization of the contracts, and have a strong out clause, both initially and then subsequently, if you find the vendor cannot maintain compliance on an ongoing basis. Negotiate that quality agreement, and be sure the vendor understands and commits to the transferred responsibility. Of course, the liability is still yours. Ensure that their documentation and procedure standards meet GxP and good documentation practices, just as you would if it was your own premises. And for core systems such as these, conduct an on-site audit. Better to be safe than sorry. They may do a very good job on a questionnaire, but there's nothing like showing up and actually seeing people face-to-face and seeing their responsiveness, engaging their mastery of the subject matter. And just because they have other life sciences firms already under their wing, don't assume that they're meeting your standard. Beware again of software vendors outsourcing to third parties. We have seen circumstances where they've outsourced to very competent, well-regarded data centers, but the data center was not aware of the regulatory obligation at all. And involve QA. Involve your QA authority in the process of the decision to outsource as soon as possible in the process once you've decided to move in that direction, or exploring it, because you'll save yourself a lot of grief later on. That's all I have. Thanks very much for listening. It's just scratching the surface, and we'll be having more on this in more depth later. Any questions?
Thanks, Larry. Appreciate you sharing that information. Really appreciate your time and effort in preparing the presentation for us. We will open the floor to questions now, as Larry mentioned. And while you're typing those questions in, I'll remind you that the session has been recorded and will be available on our website, which is usdatamanagement.com. I'd encourage you to go there and review additional upcoming webinar events, as well as check out the recorded sessions of previously presented topics. On the website page, they're actually listed along the right column, and there's quite a few across the multi-practices. So take a look and share with other departments and such. Looks like we do have questions coming in, Larry. Actually, that's a thank you. Oh, appreciate the compliment there. I appreciate that very much. Okay, here's the first question. It's from John. He's saying, besides hosting the SaaS IT vendors, do I have to audit other IT vendors?
Oh, generally, yes. And of course, it depends on the nature of your business, the level of compliance you're required, and the types of applications. But if you're bringing in specialized software from software vendors, it's very important to be able to conduct audits of these vendors. And this is a more common practice that we see where people have been used to, as part of their methodology, sending questionnaires out to these vendors of packaged software and getting them to, and often they get a lot of boilerplate back regarding their software development methodology and how they do change control and their quality unit. And then, there's a very well-defined method, set of practices in software development that meet many many standards of goodness that you would typically look for from an IT perspective, and what you will have to do internally if you develop applications. However, they're not required to do that as a package vendor at the same level of compliance as you would do internally if you're developing systems, if you're actually the manufacturer, if you're the sponsor of a drug or a device that's getting audited by the regulatory authority. You're held to a higher standard, and you're the one responsible for assuring that package or that hardware is meeting your needs. So that is the real test from a compliance perspective. So the audit of a vendor of a package is just enough to understand that they're not going to leave you in a lurch, that they'll be around for a while, that they're not going to send you a pile of junk that you're going to have to depend on and work out all the bugs on. But ultimately, you are going to expect it to be testing that and making sure it's fine before you put it into production ultimately. Yes, you have to have some demonstration that you have tried to assess the goodness of the supplier and their ability to help you meet your requirements.
Thank you, Larry. Our next question is from Katrina. It says, why would a software vendor which supplies an SaaS solution not host it themselves?
Well, there are a lot of reasons, and often it goes back to the fact that they have the same challenges you are having internally with hosting. So even though the software vendor has a lot of experience with developing software and servicing clients in your particular area, and they have consulting arms that go out and integrate and implement systems that they sell. Their internal hosting, and in our experience, their internal IT organizations and infrastructure can be frail. Their ability, what they need to just support software development, unless it's an Oracle or some of the biggest firms out there, it can be very modest for just pure software development. And so they're not equipped typically internally to host substantial volumes of data and high availability infrastructures just natively. They can't just add that on a whim. They have to make some significant investment. And if they want to demonstrate and compete with larger data centers from a SAS 70 perspective, they have to have they have to have dedicated staff, they have to have a facility, and often that's just not within their financial means, and their payback won't be substantial enough to do that on a scale basis. So the vast majority of them are going to use a third-party data center, and there are advantages, and it makes sense to do that. The question is, what's their contract look like with that vendor, with their outsourced hosting vendor? And have they done enough to make sure that the standards of quality you require are being carried out in that third-party data center from a GxP perspective? And usually the answer is no in our experience. So software vendors are not operating a compliant facility the way you are, and so they're not as intimately familiar, ironically, with what your needs are, and they're taking those on, often unbeknownst to them.
Thank you, Larry. Our next question, here's a fun one from Jackie. She's asking, what services does USDM provide to support a client's assessment of a SaaS vendor?
We basically allow you to provide a framework to do a complete assessment of the SaaS vendor. Obviously, we've had a lot of experience with various vendors in our practice, so we know what the landscape looks like out there. But most importantly, we have off-the-shelf quality agreement templates that people have adapted for use in their contractual process. We can go out and do the assessments for you or with you in partnership with you. We can give you the tools to do it yourself. So we provide a full raft of capabilities, both on the services side, and looking at the application software development, looking at the infrastructure and the management. We have the IT insight to know what best practices should be, and we also can advise you on how you can dovetail that with your own internal quality processes and systems.
Okay. And our next question from Jay. How about performance qualifications? I've used SaaS vendor previously, and the slowness and response of their web application was horrible. How can this be mitigated up front? Thank you for your answer.
Well, that's a good question. This is, as I showed in that one diagram, when you have these two blocks with the business in one and the provider in the other, you've got nothing but a network between you. And while the network may be extremely robust and high speed, there are many, many other bottlenecks in the chain, many of which you don't have visibility to. Ultimately, you need to do testing, capacity testing, and get service level agreements with the vendor, most typically about response time. An example, we were working with one of our clients recently who outsourced to a major vendor, and they were having slow response time. But they did have in their contract a certain minimum response time. And our recommendation to them was let's go back to the vendor and say, look, this is the response time. In this particular case, they actually had dedicated servers to mitigate some of this uncertainty related to the management. So they did have dedicated servers for their operation, hosted at the vendor with the vendor's software on it. And in this case, they were concerned, are they going to have to pay for the hardware? And based on the contract, no. They basically could go back and say, you're not meeting the response time requirements. It's up to the vendor to provide their bandwidth, whether that be additional servers, whether that be better networking internally, to meet that standard at no extra cost, because that was the standard set. So it always starts with the upfront negotiations, and this is where we can help a lot, because we have a very long list of points to be addressed upfront to protect you from the uncertainties that we see all the time coming up that people, in the heat of the moment, often don't think about. But that's a pretty obvious one in terms of performance, and it's one where the vendor, just like internal systems, you struggle with how to architect to meet capacity. But this is one of the arts of IT that is often trial and error, and you need provisions to enforce it.
All righty. Thank you, Larry. Next question is from Mel. Let's see. I heard that SAS 70 certifications are going away to be replaced by SOC standards for data center certifications. Can you comment?
Yes, we've seen those standards. They are merging. They're very similar in terms of their overall effect. The high degree of variability in these SAS 70 audits, and to a large degree, it's somewhat affecting the standards against which the auditors are being held to, and how the audits themselves are meant to be conducted. And in our review of SAS 70 audits, it's a very good trend, because we've seen enormously superficial SAS 70 audits by firms, and then really good in-depth audits that really got into the meat of how the processes were being managed in great detail. In one case, we, after the fact, again coming in when a client had some real difficulties with a software as a service vendor, we looked at the SaaS audit that they were depending upon for certain aspects of the infrastructure that the vendor had provided, and it was a very weak audit. I mean, it said, yeah, they're okay, but the standards they were using were pretty superficial. So there is that variable now, but it's still fundamentally going after the same key variables that need to be controlled.
Okay. The next couple I'm going to ask together. Mel is also asking, who are typically recommended to show up for the on-site vendor and data center audit? And then also, can he forego a data center audit if the vendor is solid in their own audits of the data center?
Question. I've seen a scenario exactly like that. What we recommend, well, there are cases where we have gone in and stood in for the QA representative of the client. But we went with an IT person. Now, there's been several. We go ourselves, but we recommend that someone from the client, from our client, accompany us. Usually it's an IT person. Typically the business is leaving this to IT and QA to work out. So unless there's some big issues where the business now has to get involved, if the business was originally involved with this decision. So there's also, but we certainly recommend if we do come and do the audit, then we certainly would expect an IT representative. Certainly there should be a representative of IT and QA, ideally in one form or another. So if we give you the materials and the checklist and advise you on it, then we would expect the QA person and the IT person to go and perform that activity. The second piece is that I would not, in fact, I've had these situations where the vendor claimed that they went and did an audit of the data center, and that's like asking the fox to say how many chickens are in the chicken coop. The vendor in the first place has made the assessment that that hosting provider, as an example, that they may be outsourcing to is adequate, and it may have a set of standards that it's using that are completely unrelated to what you're doing internally. They haven't seen your data center. They haven't seen the standards you put your IT people through to conform to GxP. So they're well-meaning in most cases, but they also can just be not informed about what that is. So there are very many cases where we have basically done the education for the vendor as to what their standard really needs to be by going and doing that on-site audit with them. After the fact, unfortunately, when the gap was discovered.
Larry, can you clarify what you mean by GxP qualification versus following regular SDLC process, CSV, and Part 11 guidance? And that's again from Mel.
The GxP is really effectively Part 11. I distinguish that from what you might say is a FAS 70 audit or an ISO audit where they're looking for goodness within an IT framework. There are many methodologies defined out there in IT, which certainly for SDLC, for how you manage incidents, configuration management, etc., from ITIL as an example, where there's standards that are well established in IT that you can do your audits against. And with SAS 70 is a special case where you're looking at data center specifically that you can do. So when I say GxP, it's effectively with the Part 11 component baked into it. And as you're aware, GAMP and the standards that are generally used in IT are baking in the best of ITIL, the best of ISO, COBIT, with a Part 11 component on top, which is the rigor of the documentation associated with every one of those activities that I already went through. So that's why I would call it GxP type auditing versus just a traditional IT audit.
Thank you, Larry. Okay, from Mark, says the presentation was spot on. I just went through this process and it validated my approach. Thank you. You're welcome, Mark. We're addressing many of the GxP in SLA. Heads up, most difficulty in the configuration management, i.e. complete inventories. Since we have a farm of servers, we have issues with addressing typical APIQ procedures. How do you address?
Well, that is, especially if obviously you need a lot more details related to that, but if it's a server farm with a virtual environment, this is especially troublesome. And I have a couple of cases where you obviously do an assessment and determine how is this being managed. It all goes back to what kind of traceability do you have if there's an incident. I mean, when everything goes well, everybody's happy. But when there's an incident or deviation, that's when people start asking the hard questions. And if you don't know where something's actually being executed or stored or the procedures governing it, then it becomes very embarrassing in some respects when people are doing their investigation under a CAPA. So what we generally try to do is lock down the virtual environment to a certain set of physical servers and qualify all those servers in the same manner. And more importantly, if you're talking about virtualization, and we have a separate webinar topic on this that I've done in the past, there's a qualification standard for managing server farms and VMware clusters specifically that needs to be applied from an IQ perspective. And once you have done that, you have a set of SOPs and processes and documentation standards that will allow you to control that virtual environment. People, we still run into a lot of situations where people believe the VMware or a virtual environment is the same to an application as a physical machine, because all the application sees is its native operating system, it's Windows, which is really a guest inside of VMware virtual machine as an example. But you have to be attributable to all the management of that VMware environment that's underneath it, just as you would to management of the physical machine supporting it. So you can't ignore the physical layer to say that your application is validated. So we do have a methodology that allows you to address postures effectively so that you have it well characterized and in control, and a set of SOPs that allows you to then maintain that state.
Thank you, Larry. Here's a question from Mike. What good does an SAS 70 or SOC 2 report do for a GxP hosted solution? Does the FDA recognize it?
No, it doesn't in a word. I mean, it's a nice thing to have to show that you've done due diligence, and this is a whole area that, again, we could talk about for a while. You know, what level of goodness do you need in your documentation and your due diligence to satisfy the FDA or compliance officer? And it depends on who you get, obviously, and how knowledgeable they are, how deep their questions are. You may be aware that FDA has trained a bunch of auditors recently and been hiring people with computer science degrees because they recognize the level of risk is now quite deep in these configurations of SAN and VMware type environments that go well beyond a Category 1 that you see in GAMP for infrastructure. When I do my valid qualifications now, I categorize them as Category 4 environments because they're just as configurable as an ERP system. So SAS 70 is great to wave around and say, look, I've done some due diligence here. At least it's foundational to show that these guys have met somebody's standard. But that's not something of itself. It will only show that you're doing some homework with the FDA. But if it's the only thing you've got, it's going to be seen that you're now aware of what the expectation is. That's not good.
Right. And Mike, we absolutely agree. This is absolutely a loaded topic. Let's see. The next question is from Gareth. Can you recommend an independent standard or guideline for risk assessment, whether specifically for vendors or general? And part 2 is, also, what about SSAE 16 replacing SAS 70 for data centers? Well, there you go.
Yeah, we touched on that briefly earlier in an earlier question, how that's going to sort of tighten up some of the standards and the way auditors deal with it on the level of documentation. But it's not going to change to a significant degree the character in terms of the scope of the audit. Some of the elements they need to address. But what was the first part again? Sorry.
That's okay. Can you recommend an independent standard or a guideline for risk assessment?
The most quoted one is the ISO. ISO has a whole series of risk assessment types of standards for a variety of industries. GAMP, if you look at the GAMP, they have a whole bunch of references in there on their risk assessment module as to what native sources are. NIST, National Institute of Standards, they have a risk assessment component to them as well. And often it's manufacturing oriented, but the same criteria apply to that as well.
Okay. Question from Stephen. Are there any SaaS companies that claim GxP compliance? And part 2, how have you dealt with agile development issues with SaaS vendors? And have you seen any SaaS vendors that pass all GxP expectations?
Okay, that's 3. I didn't write them down. So I'll start with the last one first. And the short answer is no. On the first go-around, I have not seen any SaaS vendors that met the standard off the bat. Now, with remediation, they could, and often there was a substantial list of remediation program with a substantial list of things they needed to do to meet that. And the whole idea of what our clients typically did is lay out a program and a project for them to meet it so the client could show to a regulatory authority that they were on the case so that they can continue to operate and that they had specific guidelines and penalties in this agreement, which was effectively their new quality agreement to meet these. But off the bat, which is often when we first come in, we have not seen that. And the previous question was what?
How have you dealt with agile development issues for SaaS vendors?
Yes, agile is particularly difficult, and it depends on the flexibility of the vendor. We've seen a couple where they have basically denied responsibility for this and said the client is responsible for that. You're validating your application, and we'll tell you when it's happening, and then you can do what you need to do to validate it, and you've got a month to do it. And so obviously that's often a non-starter, and for those vendors who've been willing to negotiate, and most do, they will address the ultimate solution was to carve off a segment of their virtual environment for the client and make releases available to the client, but the client could determine when the gating factor to make those updates apply to their particular set of requirements. Sometimes there was a cost associated with that, which was reasonable because the contract's already in place and it was never addressed. But early on, this is why we especially say that you should get this up front, make it clear that you're going to need to have an approval before updates are applied. And it can usually be accommodated, but there may have to be some architectural provision to do it. Because as you're aware, most of these vendors, their business model is buying a big set of very robust resources and spreading them across customers in a virtual environment, a multi-tenant environment also.
Mm-hmm. Here's a good question from Valiant. Again, same kind of issue. It seems like there should be a lot of requirements built into the service agreements as to what the expectancy is from the SaaS company. And if the initial agreements are lacking, they're lacking the requirements, what can be done to see if the adequate GxP requirements are met?
Well, you've got it exactly right. I mean, it all starts at the beginning, and after the fact, it's very, very difficult to modify them, and it's very contentious. And what we've typically seen is that the assertions were given to the client, to our client, that they are compliant, and because they had references of some kind, they went on a level of trust. And then when they brought us in to do an audit because somebody noticed that something wasn't properly handled, then we discovered the gap. And then based on the assertions that the vendor provided, you have a lot of leverage to come in and say, you got to do some remediation here. Preferably you've done that before you're actually going live, but often it's after the fact. So it goes, early on, if you're at the point where you're just doing the contract, we have a template that describes all the points, many of which we've just talked about, that need to be explicitly laid out, whether you call that part of your SLA with them or whether that's a separate quality agreement. We've done both, but done it both ways. So depending on what your preference is, we prefer a separate quality agreement because often there's different authorities involved reviewing it from a subject matter expertise perspective. But that is the pivotal foundation for for compliance, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and looks like we'll take our last question from Tom. Are hosted systems generally considered an open system or a closed system?
Well, again, it depends on who's doing the administration is usually the guideline for that. So if you're doing data administration, then technically it could be considered a closed systems. However, I err on the side of caution and prefer to deal with them as open systems because you've got multiple hands in the pie doing administration often. They may be doing database administration while you're doing data administration. But backup and restores are their responsibility as well as all the other very key components of updates, et cetera. And of course, you're accessing it with a VPN over a network, and you've got a little less control over your accessibility and access and administration of access. So in terms of the level of testing involved in which is really all this really changes, is the fact that you'll do some more documentation in your qualification for an open system. I would treat it as an open system to be safe. That's my recommendation.
Thank you, Larry. Boy, we do appreciate all of you attending and for staying on, contributing here to such an interesting Q&A session. We also invite you to continue the discussion by joining our LinkedIn forum on the USDM LinkedIn group page. We welcome your insight there, your feedback, and certainly your suggestions for future topics. If you're having pain points that need addressing, maybe you're struggling or just need to confirm that you're on the right track, please let us know. We'd be happy to help. If you appreciate today's presentation, let us know that by clicking on the like button, or even better, post a comment. It'll take you just a few seconds and would mean quite a bit to us. This year, it's going to be an important indicator that our management team is looking at and using as a basis to continue to fund our complimentary webinar series. So let us know your thoughts there. Larry, thank you again. Tremendous presentation today, and thank you all for taking the time to join us. On behalf of the U.S. Data Management team, we appreciate the opportunity to team with you towards excellence in compliance. Have a wonderful day.